Hi, this is János, this is Real World Audio, and today we are talking about the Fletcher-Munson curves, or what most audiophiles and people who are into music and listening, they say always Fletcher and Munson curves, but really Fletcher and Munson, this is 1930s. So since then we had 3 generations pass, and now we call these actually equal loudness contours. And here you see the 2003 revision with the red lines, that's the revision. But since then we had a 2023 revision as well. So now we are 4 generations beyond Fletcher and Munson. And as you see, there has been quite a lot of change since 4 generations ago. And yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And before I get into any of this, I really want to say what is my background on this, and what is my capacity that I'm talking about these Fletcher and Munson curves and the human hearing. And my background is being an audiophile, a person who listens to music with awareness. I think that's the biggest difference between audiophiles and non-audiophiles, is that an audiophile listens with awareness and not just, he's not just a passive sufferer of sound hitting his or her eardrum, but someone who is maintains a level of consciousness while listening. So I've been doing that, basically consciously listening to sounds and music since I was a kid, and I have received instructions early on about that from my grandfather, who was an outstanding musician. And since then, when I had my mentor, Stu Ono, who was an audiophile, a musician as well, and he was, I think, and many others think, the ultimate golden ear who lived on planet Earth, and I had the fortune to learn from him a lot, and also what I have experienced during these past 30, 40 years, how my friends fared, how their hearing changed by listening to various audio systems. And plus, as a background, I do not have a medical background in audiology, so I'm not an audiology expert, but I am a biomedical researcher, but in the field of cancer. So it's quite unrelated, but yes, I do have some biological background, and I'm not coming from that place where virtually every audiophile is coming from, where they have absolutely zero clue about the human body, and all they know is just the brochures that the speaker salesman gave them. So or they have engineer friends, but what about the biology? Yeah, nada. So now let's get back to talking about these loudness contours, which the Fletcher-Munson curves were the primitive versions for that, and they really, I think, based on my opinion, please correct me if I'm not correct about that, these blue lines, they are the ones, the Fletcher-Munson curves, is that that was how the hearing of the human beings was perceived, was described in the 1930s. So what are these curves representing? What is it? We want to understand that. So here you see that this describes here, this axis, the frequency from 10 hertz, 100 hertz, kilohertz, 10 kilohertz, 100 kilohertz. As you see, it's a logarithmic scale. And here we have the other scale is for the sound pressure level. 0 dB is here, minus 10 dB, 10 dB, 20, 30, and go on up till 130 dB. What is dB? So that's basically the sound pressure level, the energy that the sound carries. So when you put a microphone, a measuring microphone, then it's going to measure the energy that the sound wave is carrying. So this is representing the actual energy, the physical energy behind the sound. And as you see, when we plot the actual physical energy of the sound versus the frequency, then the human ear will not hear it as having the same energy, but the perception will change along these curves. And why are there so many curves? Because depending on what is the level of the energy of the sound, the human ear is going to hear different relationship between high frequency, mid-range and low frequencies. So that's what the Fletcher-Munson curves are about, is that and the equal loudness contours as well, as we call them today, is that what we can call as the level of how loud it is and how loud the brain thinks it is based on the 1 kilohertz level. So that's the reference for our brain, that when you hear a music or hear a sound, you have to hear a complex sound to make sense for the brain of how loud it is. If you just hear a single note, then the ear cannot do much about it if it's just a high frequency or if it's a low frequency. If it's around a kilohertz or so, then the ear can gauge how loud it is, because then it can convert the energy, the dB, to phone. So that's the phone is the measurement unit of the perceived volume of the sound, and dB, decibel, is the measurement unit for the energy of the sound. And these two scales, the phone and the dB, they meet at 1 kilohertz. So 1 kilohertz, whatever dB, is the same phone as the 1 kilohertz. But when you go for today the updated version, when we go for the threshold, there they are a little bit different, but down to 20 phone 20 dB, they are at 1 kilohertz always the same. And so that's it. So one thing about this phone to dB conversion is that we need to know that the human brain and human ear is not a computer. It's not a measuring microphone, because for a measuring microphone, whatever sound, whatever frequency, it will give you the actual dB, and it will tell you how loud it is for the measurement system. But for the human brain, that number is meaningless, completely meaningless, unless it's around 1 kilohertz or so. And if we are dropping low, let's say like 100 hertz or 20 hertz, or going up to like 20 kilohertz, if you hear a 20 kilohertz note, well, most people don't, but even those who hear, they just by the note itself, they have zero clue how loud it is. And so you don't know. To be able to tell how loud those extreme frequencies are, you also need to hear a note that's around in the kilohertz region or somewhere in the mid-range, so that the ear can reference them together, because that's how the ear works. We hear two notes and then we can quite accurately gauge the volume level difference between the two, the relationship between the two. Not the dB relationship, but the phone relationship. And when you have hearing damage, then this relationship changes, and you will think that the low frequencies and the high frequencies are quieter than what you perceived when you had good hearing. And that's why you have to crank up both the bass and both the highs to hear them. And as you have more and more hearing damage, you have to crank them up more and more, which will cause you even more hearing damage, so you have to crank it even more, and up to a point where your stereo will run out of gain and your ear will run out of space. But even then, in many cases, if you can crank it up loud enough, you will still hear it. But for you, it will be just a whisper, the loudness that you hear at the very high and the very low. But if you have your nephew coming in or someone in tech hearing, they will run out right away, because it's just way overloading them. It's just way too loud. And so let's get more into this phone versus dB thing. And as you see here, I'm not going to go too much more into it. One thing I want to say about these curves, Fletcher-Munson versus equal loudness contours, is that I think for Fletcher-Munson what he did is that he had his speaker set to a set level, and then he scanned the frequency range, and he was doing listening test. What is it, the minimum that we can hear? And then he plotted this line for the absolute minimum that he could hear. And then he put it like 20 dB louder, and then he scanned all those frequencies and then adjusted the volume so that the apparent perception is 20 dB more, so that each of the sound, as you go up and down, they felt as if they are the same volume. I think that was the basis how it all started. And as you see, when you are playing very quietly, then as we go down in the bass, you have to crank up the volume extremely. So you see, at 2-3 kilohertz we are at like -7 dB, and by the time he reached 30 hertz he had to crank it up to 60 dB. So that's almost 70 dB more energy, which means like several million times higher energy for the 30 hertz note to be barely audible compared to a 2 kilohertz note. And when he went higher and higher with the volume, how much you need that low energy cranked up decreases, and he noticed when he's at 100 phone level, 100 dB at 1 kilohertz, then he could go down to 30 hertz, and then he had an impression that he was listening at the same volume. And now with the new ISO standard, it says that no, we have to crank much higher to have the same impression. And I think for that, the main difference is that in our age, we have tremendously more hearing damage compared to 3 generations ago. And that was something that I noticed as a child when I was talking to my grandfather, grandparents, their generation, observing what they heard, how their hearing worked. And I was always shocked that in the bass department, their hearing was so much more accurate and astute, and they could perceive so much quieter sounds than what I could perceive as a kid in the bass region. And I think the biggest change here, what we see here in the upper regions, is that our generation is particularly deaf in the bass, because we are subject to so much low frequency noises. Number one, when we are commuting in the car, it has extremely loud low frequency rumbles. Air conditioning, extremely loud low frequency rumbles. City noise in general, really loud low frequency rumbles. And stereo gear, we crank it up again just to blast away whatever hearing we had. And yes, so I think this is the tragic side effect of modernization. And of course, if you go to rural areas where people are much less subjective to noise, they will not think that 20 hertz is at 130 dB for 100 phone level. For them, the perception will be most likely around 100 or 110. But the most important thing is that in the old days, I think for Fletcher and Munson, they were measured, these lines, and now for the ISO 226 standard, these curves are not measured anymore. They are produced by equations, which have no biological correlation to any human being at all. They are just estimates that are supposed to just fit to the majority of human beings, which is works for, you know, like to set standards like how much noise your workers can be subject to in a mine or a loud environment. But for you personally, how do you hear it? This doesn't tell you anything, because for those who live in in a rural area will be very different from those who live with very loud noise pollution in their environment. And me, I grew up in Europe and Africa and in Brazil, and in my adult life I live in the United States, and I can tell that there is an absolute vast mind-blowing difference between where you grow up and where you live and how much noise pollution is. When I moved to the United States, I almost went mad from the noise pollution to adapt, and it took me like 5 years to get used to it. My first 5 years was the constant suffering because of the high noise level in the city here. And because when I was a kid, often I lived in rural areas, and there's, you know, there's just the forest, there's nothing, there's no noises. And compared to Honolulu, it's just everything, you know, you go mad, you truly go mad if you are used to quiet sounds, quiet areas. Then all of these loud noises which are present in this area, they will be very destructive for your hearing. And also same is true in the high frequency. And as you see here, there's just only a dotted line for the equal loudness contour, because the equations go only to 12.5 kilohertz. They don't even try to make calculations beyond that, and there's nothing above that. So it's kind of a sad thing that there's no guidance beyond 12.5 kilohertz nowadays. But the same is true for the loudness, that the noises that are there have to be much higher in energy to be perceived at a certain volume than what they are. And especially as you drop your listening volume, you comparably the energy of those very high frequencies has to be much higher. And why is all that? Why nature had to come up with this bizarre thing? Why don't we have a measuring microphone in our heads? Would be so much easier, right? No, it would not. And part of that is what my experience that I just shared with you is, that our hearing, how it is, whether you have this flat curve. So for example, if you grow up in a rural area somewhere in Africa, then this is how your ears will calibrate. You will have intact hearing in the base. But if you grow up in United States, in a metropolis, then these red lines are the ones that apply to you, and that's because that's your natural surroundings. So when you don't have these tremendous noises impacting you, then you can have an intact hearing, because it doesn't interfere with your functioning. Still, even in a rural area, your lowest curve is going like that. Do you know why? Why it's going up to like 70 dB or ish at 20 hertz? That's because our own muscles produce those sound waves. So the muscles, they start making twitching sound frequencies at 70 hertz. So the fast twitch muscles, they operate at 70 hertz frequency, and they, when you crunch your muscles, those fast twitch muscles emit 70 hertz sound waves. And that's but that's relatively few of those most of those muscles that we have are like slow twitch, and the slow twitch ones, they emit between 20 and 30 hertz sounds. So that's why the 20 hertz and or below 30 hertz sounds are just so hard to perceive, because that's how loud, or muscles emit about 70 dB loud 20 hertz sounds when you hit the gym, and you push the weights, or even when you are just walking and jogging, or you just move around in your chair. That's 20 hertz 70 dB sounds for you, and you don't want to hear them every time to make a movement, so your brain filters it out because it doesn't want you to get distracted by your own sounds. So that's the biological basis of the Fletcher-Munson curve, that we want to filter out the noises that we make in the base region. And these noises, when you are in a modern metropolis, these also include not just the ones that your body makes, but the ones that your air condition makes, that your car makes, that your city noise makes. And that's why we end up with these brutal red curves in the base region. And my example exemplifies that if your hearing is intact, you have curves that correspond to the blue lines, then you will go mad. Then you are thrown into a metropolis, and I mean not mad like become a cuckoo or something, but I had really hard time just going to sleep, and just I was in pain. My ears and my hearing system was in constant pain for years. And that's why people's ears adapt, so that you don't hear those noises anymore, so you are not in pain anymore. And yes, as our culture gets more and more technological, these curves are going higher and higher, and we lose the ability to hear noise more and more. And there is a very vast difference between how people perceive music in different continents, and part of that is how big their background noise is. So that's why people who are in most parts of Europe, or in Japan, where noise pollution is taken very seriously, and even if you live in a metropolis, there is tremendously more regulation and rules about noise pollution. It's much more quieter than in the United States. Here it's totally bonkers. Your neighbor cranks up the Harley at 5 a.m. you go deaf. If this happened in Europe, the guy would, just police would show up right away and take his Harley. You cannot do that in an urban area. But here it's fine, and people in fact make a show of it to make it louder and louder. Like my dear neighbor, he had a Kawasaki bike, and it just is freaking loud, and he started it under our bedroom's window, and when he started and that's like at 5 a.m. It's just crazy. On the weekend you try to sleep and he wants to go biking. Yeah, so we put on like really tough insulation, like got actually windows from Europe, imported windows from Germany, which are like really good isolation, and now finally we can sleep. And you know what? A week later, what the fudge? Imagine he changed his Harley to his Kawasaki to a Harley Davidson, to a much louder bike. So he's now really glad, and we are just dang, what the fudge. So anyway, last week I saw that he changed his exhaust pipes to much bigger ones, so he even upgraded his Harley sound to make it even louder than what it was. So that's the sad primitive state that we have to deal with here in the United States. People can play around with whatever they want without any respect whatsoever to their neighbors and the hearing. And there is a secondary result on audiophiles, that as a result, people have hearing damage. They don't even notice anymore that they are causing hearing damage to their neighbors, and they just crank up the bass And that's why in United States everything is just so much more bass heavy, and whatever gear sells well in Europe or in Japan, it will not sell in the United States, because here people are deaf and they have to crank bass much higher than to just to hear it. But uh, I cannot say everyone is deaf. I have loads of audiophile friends here who are not deaf yet, who haven't gone deaf despite any odds, and part of that is just you need just to be sensible and use hearing protection, hearing aid as much as you can, and with that, even here you can maintain your hearing. So I think that's the most important bit, that protect your hearing, and do not just crank the volume up. So when you have a problem that you are not hearing enough bass, enough highs, then before you just get a much louder system, just make sure that your room has a low noise floor. Just try insulating your room first. If you live in United States, this is absolutely vital, that bring down the noise floor. If the noise floor in your room is 50 dB or higher, you have absolutely zero chance to have a decent listening experience at any volume, because you would have to just crank the system so loud to overcome this vast noise floor, that by that time it's going to cause you as much hearing damage that you will lose whatever little you have remaining at this point. So number one most important thing is just make sure that your room is as isolated as possible. Bring down the noise floor below 30 dB on the average. So and actually, when people say how many dB is your noise floor in the room, it will be it's not the same for every frequency. Whatever dB is at like 1 kilohertz. So like 30 dB at 1 kilohertz, and when it's like 30 dB at 1 kilohertz, then most likely at 10 to 15 kilohertz, it will be close to 0 dB. But when you go to 20 hertz, then most likely it will be like 50 dB or even more. So that's kind of how general noise floors work in a more modern environment. And just try to keep the noise floor in the mid-range below 30, and then if you can keep it down to 20 dB, 10 dB, that's will make a tremendous difference. And then finally you can let your ears adapt to that nice quiet environment and just hear sounds without overwhelming your ears. So now we are already pushing half an hour, so I'm going to take a break here, and we are going to get more into what these mean, and why is it important to understand the phones versus decibels, and what happens when you change the volume on your audio gear. That will be part of the next episode. And for now, have an astonishingly wonderful day. If you like this video, just hit that like thing if you'd like to. If you are a new person, just hit subscribe, and then you can, when you look for my channel, you will easily find more videos. And I have this buy me a coffee account thingy. If you feel like you want to donate for my channel, please do so by all means. If not, I'm not pressuring you, I'm not pressuring anyone to do that, but many have asked me, János, is there a way to help you, to contribute, to give back to you? And that's why I started the Buy Me a Coffee account. So I want to say that there is such a venue possible if you want to, and if you have donated like Gerard and so many did on a regular basis, thank you so much. It's making a tremendous difference. So we will continue from here. Bye bye.